The concept of the midair collision is horrifying if you are an air traveler. It's about the last thing you'd ever want to be involved in. It carries such a deadly connotation with it. We've looked at a number of midair collisions over the years, perhaps though none are more systemically egregious than that of the Zagreb incident. Where this midair collision differs from most we've talked about recently is that this accident occurred in high-altitude airspace, in what was supposed to be some of the most closely watched airways in Europe. This wasn't during approach, not involving small private planes. This was a case of large planes, high altitude, same place, same time. Forget for a moment all of the technology that has been developed over the years to prevent this exact type of accident. It's 1976, you're an air traffic controller, you're sat there looking at your radar screen as two radar echoes merge, then disappear. Imagine for a moment the weight one must have to carry, knowing they had a direct hand in what was the deadliest midair collision to have ever occurred at that time. The Zagreb disaster is, by the way, still to this day, the third deadliest accident in this category. This was the burden given to one unfortunate controller on September 10th, 1976. However, as we go through this story, we'll stumble across numerous problems plaguing Yugoslavia airspace, and many people in the years since this disaster have questioned whether the air traffic controller was really the one at fault. September 10th, 1976. London Heathrow, 9:30 in the morning local time. British Airways Flight 476 was preparing for departure. On board were 63 passengers and crew. 44-year-old Captain Dennis Tan is at the flight controls. He was a captain of over 10,000 hours. Also on the flight deck was the much younger first officer, 29-year-old Brian Helm. Also on the flight deck in the third pilot's position was second officer Martin Flint, aged 24. That day, the three men were in charge of Flight 476 to Istanbul. It was the beginning of what was going to be a long day for the pilots. They weren't expecting to be back in London until the evening. At 9:32, Flight 476 was airborne out of Heathrow and made for a southeasterly heading across the European continent. For the next hour and a half, they'd be handed from one controller to the next from region to region. The flight's cruising altitude was 33,000 feet. The plane the pilots were flying was a Hawker Siddeley Trident III. It's an aircraft that British Airways inherited from the massive merger of multiple predecessor airlines in 1974, the two big ones being BOAC and British European Airways, which was where this plane came from. The Trident is a plane we have talked about recently on the channel. In the 1970s, the Trident was the British plane often used on many European flights in and out of London. The Trident III was the larger, stretched variant of the plane, and here's the thing about the Trident. It had a nickname amongst its pilots. They'd sometimes call it the ground gripper, as in it required a long takeoff run to get going. So the most notable thing about this change of size from previous models was the need for an additional fourth booster engine concealed within the tail. It was seldom used, but did provide extra thrust for pilots to use on shorter runways or airports with high elevation. So the Trident III is seen by those in the know as the trijet with 4 engines. The flight plan of Flight 476 would take the Trident through some of the most congested airspace in Europe. Later in the flight, the plane was expected to fly through high-altitude airways over Yugoslavia, intercepting the waypoint at Zagreb. It is at this point that we should break down the Yugoslavia airspace at the time. But first, if you are a younger viewer, especially if you are outside of Europe, you may not know of the country of Yugoslavia. Though it doesn't have much to do with this accident, I believe we should at least go over the basic level political geography of this former country, just so we're all on the same page as to where we are in the world here. Yugoslavia was a country. It no longer exists today. On a map of Europe, this was Yugoslavia highlighted here. The country broke apart in the 1990s, and today a total of 7 countries now make up the land of the former Yugoslavia. The capital city of Yugoslavia was Belgrade, now the capital of modern-day Serbia. One of the other countries of former Yugoslavia is Croatia. Its capital is Zagreb. This is where we're focusing on today. Yugoslavia was used as a prime airway for international air traffic. Multiple different airways intersected at the Zagreb VOR, located just a few miles northeast of the Zagreb airport. A VOR is a radio navigational aid. Used a lot more frequently back then, a VOR broadcasts a signal on a specific frequency. Pilots tune into that same frequency and follow the signal. In the case of the Zagreb VOR, it was the intersection of 6 different air corridors between other waypoints. You could easily imagine the Zagreb VOR in this context as a 6-way road intersection, only in the air. British Airways Flight 476 was to make its way through here later that September morning, but we are not done yet talking about this airspace. If you cast your mind back to the Aeromexico 498 video a few weeks back, we talked about how airspace is 3-dimensional. This doesn't just apply to airspace around airports, but also at high altitude too. The way that Yugoslavian aviation authorities broke this down further was by sectioning off different regions of altitude. There were different radio stations to call, and these were the lower sector below 25,000 feet, the middle sector between 25 and 31,000 feet, and the upper sector above 31,000 feet. Controlling the upper sector that fateful morning was 28-year-old Gradimir Tasic. He had been on duty from 7 o'clock that morning. This was a man who, when he turned up for work that day, probably never expected that he wouldn't be going home at the end of his shift. Soon though, he'd be in contact with British Airways Flight 476. Tasic was going to be just yet another controller in that flight's chain. It, however, was not the only plane he would be controlling that day. Around 160 miles to the south lays the Croatian city of Split. Split, like many coastal towns and cities in southern Europe, it is a holiday destination, even was so back in the 1970s. In fact, Yugoslavia was once a prime holiday destination with those traveling from northern Europe. That day in September 1976, a Douglas DC-9 was chartered from the Yugoslav airline Inex Adria to fly from Split to Cologne in West Germany. The flight was primarily taking German tourists home, flying as Inex Adria Flight 550. In comparison to the half-full British Airways Trident, Flight 550 was actually a full plane, with 113 passengers and crew on board. In command of the DC-9 was 51-year-old Captain Jože Krumpak, another captain of 10,000 flight hours. His co-pilot and first officer was 29-year-old Dusan Ivanush. Flight 550 got airborne at 10:48 local time. It would be in the air for little under half an hour before disaster. At roughly the time of departure of Flight 550, British Airways Flight 476 was cruising over Austrian airspace. In communication with controllers in Vienna, they estimated reaching the Zagreb intersection at 11:14 local time. The airway that leads towards Zagreb the BA plane was flying along was known as the UB5 airway, approaching Zagreb from the northwest. Inex Adria Flight 550 had joined the B9 airway, heading towards Zagreb from the south. By happenstance, they were going to reach the Zagreb waypoint at the same time. The DC-9 was cleared through multiple flight levels, first to 13,000, followed by 18,000, then 24,000, and eventually 26,000 feet. In communication with the lower sector controllers, Flight 550 needed to report their altitude as they climbed. Once reaching 26,000 feet, they would be put in communication with the controllers of the middle sector. In the 1970s, the common way to keep track of flight information on a controller's end was to keep and update a progress strip. Basically, a controller will have written down on a small piece of paper the most basic of flight information. This could include relevant information such as altitude. These days, it's very antiquated. However, in the age before modern radar technology, this was generally the way controllers kept track of planes once they were identified on a controller's radar screen. Now would be a good time to revisit the Zagreb controllers to give further background context to their situation. Despite the Zagreb airspace being some of the most busiest and congested airspace in Europe, it wasn't without complaints from the controllers. The Zagreb region was extremely short-staffed. They had about half of the controllers necessary to function within reasonable means. What I mean by this is there just weren't that many air traffic controllers there. Yugoslavia had failed to train enough controllers, so the ones that were working were doing extreme overtime. Gradimir Tasic, in control of the upper sector of Zagreb that day, was performing his third consecutive 12-hour shift. Tasic was joined by a colleague in controlling the upper sector that day, a man by the name of Mladen Hochberger. Being an air traffic controller is already a demanding job, even for the most competent of controllers. To perform as necessary under these sorts of hours, well, I can't really begin to imagine it. Due to the lack of controllers, Tasic was actually often controlling the upper sector completely alone. Like the other controllers in Zagreb, he was under a lot of pressure. Overworking the workers wasn't the only problem. At the time, in 1976, secondary radar was sort of new. Zagreb had received the new secondary radar systems that can display more flight information on the radar display instead of just a blip. The problem was that controllers felt they hadn't received adequate training on how to use it correctly, or know what rules were in place to govern its use. On top of that, it was known that the radar was faulty, and sometimes actually gave unreliable or incorrect altitude information of aircraft. Tasic himself would later testify as such, and we'll touch upon that later. This was in contrast to other European countries, who not only had properly functioning radar systems, but had the necessary staff, and they knew how to use the new technology. It didn't help that though budgets were put forward for approval by the Yugoslav government, these were often cut. Compounding against these problems, the Zagreb controllers were facing the massive increase in air travel over the space of just a few years. More people were flying, which meant there were more planes in the sky. Flights between Europe and the Middle East, Asia, and even flights that further routed to and from Australia all passed overhead Yugoslavia. 11 o'clock. Controllers in Zagreb had been tracking the NX Adria flight as it climbed through the lower and middle sectors. Meanwhile, the BA Trident was passing over Klagenfurt in Austria, approaching the northern border of Yugoslavia. They had just finished communicating with Austrian controllers, who handed them off to Zagreb. British Airways Flight 476 made contact with Gradimir Tasic in Yugoslavia. They reported their position, their altitude of 33,000 feet, or flight level 330, and estimated passing Zagreb at 11:14. To identify the BA plane on his radar, Tasic gave the plane a transponder squawk code. This would identify which echo on the radar screen is the BA plane. This brief exchange would be the only piece of communication Tasic would have with the British Airways plane. The atmosphere inside the cockpit of the Trident was highly relaxed. Unlike the NX Adria DC-9, they were in the middle of the cruise of their rather long flight. Casual conversations were recorded on the cockpit voice recorder. Captain Tan was reading a newspaper, whilst the first officer was even doing a crossword. The British Airways crew would later come under criticism. Even though once a plane is in the air and there is little for the pilots to do, they are still responsible for the safe operation of the plane, and therefore should have been on the lookout for other traffic, not doing crossword puzzles. During that quick conversation between the BA and Tasic, NX Adria Flight 550 made a radio call to a middle sector controller by the name of Bojan Urjevic. He wasn't working the middle sector alone. He was joined by a Gradimir Pelin. Yes, there were two people working there with the same first name. Flight 550 made a request to climb to a higher altitude. There was an issue with this request though. Many higher altitudes were unavailable to take at that time. They were, however, given the opportunity to climb to flight level 350, or 35,000 feet, to which they accepted. The DC-9 was to remain at 26,000 until they got word from the upper sector that they could climb. At the surface level, in theory, the two planes should still avoid conflict, right? 11:05. Over at the upper sector station, Tasic's work colleague Mladen Hochberger left his seat to track down his replacement, as he was expected to be relieved of duty. Tasic, from this moment, was left alone to control the upper sector. Remember, there wasn't just the two accident planes flying around here. Tasic was responsible for numerous other planes. he was about to receive in Exadria Flight 550 in addition to the planes he's already controlling. Back in the middle sector, Erjavec turned to Pelin and asked if he could guide the DC-9 to the upper sector. He took the DC-9's flight progress strip and made his way over to the upper sector console where Tasic was working alone to see if he could take the plane. It was at this point that an apparent breakdown of communication took place, and the story differs depending on who you ask. Basically though, Tasic, working alone, was too busy to immediately start a conversation about the DC-9. When Pelin did manage to communicate with him to hand the plane over, Pelin claimed that he told Tasic that the DC-9 was wanting to climb into the upper sector into his region of control, specifically 35,000 feet, and even pointed to the DC-9 on his radar. Tasic, however, would later dispute this. His version of events was that Pelin pointed to the blip on his radar belonging to Flight 550 and told him that simply that this aircraft wanted to climb to 35,000 feet, but Tasic was waiting for crossing traffic, and once that cleared, he gave the okay for the plane to climb, but Tasic only wanted the plane to climb once passing Zagreb, according to that version of events. He would also later dispute Pelin's claim that he possessed the flight progress strip with altitude information. Basically, the key thing to know here is that Tasic was unaware that this was going to be a handoff very soon, and that the plane would be his responsibility. 11:07. The clearance was given for Exadria Flight 550 to climb to 35,000 feet. They were told to report 31,000 feet. From there, they would be handed off to Gradimir Tasic in the upper sector. This was a very awkward climb for the DC-9. There was a lot of reporting altitudes, leveling off and climbing again, and things were about to get more awkward. 5 minutes later, 11:12, the DC-9 had reached 31,000 feet. It was at this point that the middle sector handed the plane over to Gradimir Tasic. During the handoff, they requested that the DC-9's transponder be set to standby. They were to receive a new identifying code from Tasic. Under normal circumstances, they'd get this new identification in the first radio transmission with the upper sector. However, when they tuned into this new frequency, it was evident to the DC-9 pilots that the controller, Gradimir Tasic, was very busy juggling multiple other planes. According to reports, there were 4 different conversations going on between Tasic and the other aircraft, so they weren't able to make contact straight away. It would take them nearly 2 minutes to make the first contact. The DC-9 continued its climb up to 35,000 feet, as they were approaching Zagreb imminently. Flight 550 was not able to make contact with Tasic until 11:14, less than 1 minute to disaster. Let's back up and observe the situation here as it stands at 11:14 in 0 seconds. Tasic had his hands full with controlling multiple planes. He has not had a need to make further contact with British Airways 476 since their initial communication. According to his radar, he thinks they are at 33,500 feet. Key point of interest here. This altitude, as indicated on the radar, was incorrect. The radar was faulty. British Airways Flight 476 correctly reported their altitude of 33,000. The Zagreb radar was displaying this as flight level 335, 33,500. He could see the radar echo belonging to Exadria 550, he had not yet identified it properly on his radar. When the DC-9 declared their altitude of flight level 325, which is 32,500, he realized the problem. The DC-9 was going to continue to climb. It looked like it was going to cross directly into the path of the BA Trident, directly overhead the Zagreb intersection. He could see that a midair collision was imminent if he didn't intervene. Flustered, confused, and maybe even panicking, Gradimir Tasic instinctively reverted to his native Serbo-Croatian tongue, where he ordered Flight 550 to stop climbing. Obviously, it takes time for someone to firstly process the instruction and then secondly execute it. So by the time the pilots of the DC-9 began leveling off, they were already at 33,000 feet. What Tasic was now looking at was 2 planes about to merge on his radar, one at an altitude of 33,000 feet, and the other what he believed was 33,500 feet. He even notified the DC-9 of the Trident traffic about to cross their position at 335. In theory, the two would have missed each other. Due to faulty radar equipment, the altitude of the BA was incorrect. The two planes were now on a collision course with 10 seconds to disaster. There's two things you should know here. Firstly, Tasich spoke to the DC-9 in this moment of crisis in their native language. Normally, controllers are supposed to speak English. It is the international standard for air traffic control. For speaking with aircraft of Yugoslavia, he was permitted to speak in Croatian. The thing is, this may have had an unintended consequence. The pilots of British Airways 476 would have been tuned into and listening to these radio calls. None of the three pilots on board the Trident could speak Croatian, therefore would not have been able to decipher any sense of danger from these radio transmissions. The second thing, the math was done after the accident. Sadly, if Tasich had not intervened, the two planes would have missed each other, and the disaster would not have occurred. In the days before traffic avoidance technology on board airplanes, there was no advanced warning given to the crew of the Trident, and evidently they never saw the plane from their windows. At 11:14 and 41 seconds, the left wing of the DC-9 sliced into the cockpit and forward passenger cabin of the Trident. Tasich watched as the two planes merged, separated for a moment, then disappeared from radar. He made multiple attempts to contact the DC-9 with no response. He tried the Trident. No response. 15 miles out from Zagreb, a Lufthansa plane was flying down the same airway as the British Airways. They observed the midair collision themselves and radioed back what they saw. The wreckage of the two planes tumbled from the sky and crashed into the countryside below. The small village of Verbovic, around 20 miles northeast of Zagreb, became the scene of the disaster. A first responder, a local police officer, shortly arrived at the scene of the smouldering wreckage of the British Airways Trident. They later reported that they found one survivor, unbelievably. This initial survivor was an infant who showed some signs of life. Separately, local residents found a young boy, a child, laying on a road, who was barely alive and suffered fatal injury. The two young survivors soon passed away. All 176 people on board the two planes were killed. As the gravity of the situation began to set in with Zagreb controllers, Tasich was reportedly left in a state of shock, his skin pale. By noon that day, Tasich, along with 4 other controllers, were taken in for questioning. As we laid out earlier in this video, there were many underlying systemic problems plaguing the air traffic control sector in Yugoslavia. In the inquiry that followed, most controllers involved in the accident were released. It was solely Gradimir Tasich who was imprisoned for his role in the accident. In the aftermath of the disaster, generally the consensus, and something I will personally agree with, is that Gradimir Tasich was the Yugoslav government's scapegoat for the accident. It was a lot easier for them to pin the blame on this one controller instead of fixing the prominent issues that were evidently known to controllers before the accident. Even though Tasich was sent to prison, he had his supporters, not just in Yugoslavia, but also internationally. After serving 2 years behind bars, Gradimir Tasich was released from prison in November of 1978. His name, at least in my book, is cleared. At this point, you probably don't need me to reiterate the steps that have been taken over the years to prevent mid-air collisions. Planes are now fitted with traffic avoidance technology, and pilots are further trained in the area of its use. Radar is now more sophisticated and coverage across the world far more plentiful. Certain areas of airspace, especially around busy airports, are restricted to only the expected traffic. The mid-air collision is an issue that engineers had been trying to fix pretty much since the dawn of commercial aviation. Thankfully, today, they are largely a thing of the past. When we hear of mid-air collisions in the news today, they don't tend to be in the area of commercial services, and are more of a thing that happens at, say, air shows, and for different reasons. The last time a high-profile mid-air collision took place, like the one over Zagreb, was the accident in Brazil, which occurred in 2006. A disaster like this has not occurred since. Hello everyone, thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to leave a like and subscribe, as there is already another video in the works coming next weekend. The Zagreb midair collision is actually one I have wanted to do for the longest time, although I never really knew anything about it until I started researching it recently. It was one of those I had always known about but didn't know the specifics on. I'm glad we finally got it done. Let me know what you thought in the comments below. Also, we are, for now, finally done talking about the Trident. I might have another interesting plane for you next week though, so stay tuned for that. Anyway, it is that time of the week where I must take a moment to thank my amazing patrons over on Patreon for their amazing and generous support to the channel. Their names are scrolling on the screen right now, so if you do see your name here, a massive thanks to you. Shout out this week to Florian Ratz and Brett Schwartz. Your pledges are very much appreciated. Thank you so much. If you yourself would like to support the channel further and even get your name featured here at the end of the next video, you can join the Disaster Breakdown Patreon from just £1 per month, and the link to that will be in the pinned comment below. All patrons get early access to all new content 2 days before it goes out publicly on YouTube. If you would like to follow me on my personal Twitter page, that too will be linked in the pinned comment. And that is it for me today. Have a great day and weekend, and I shall see you next week. Goodbye.